content for this discussion on the future of journalism, the particular focus on the relationship between digital platforms and news publishers, but also I'm open to kind of a broader discussion to see where we go, thinking about business models, innovation, and how to best achieve those goals. I'm Matthew Lesh. I'm the Director of Communications and Public Policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and I'm joined by an excellent panel from across different parts of thinking in politicians, economists, and the news media industry themselves. The internet has very much challenged the traditional news publisher business model by increasing competition for audiences as well as advertising revenue. And the future of journalism can at times feel extremely uncertain, if not in peril. At the same time, we have a proliferation of new platforms, new modes of getting out information, and new opportunities. A particular point of tension that I'm keen to explore today, but not exclusively, is this question about whether or not, following the model that's been pursued in Australia, or also more recently in Canada, whether there should be some kind of final offer bargaining mechanism or some kind of required arbitration between digital platforms and news publishers for the claimed use of news content or news snippets or news links on digital platforms. And we can discuss whether or not that's justifiable, and then perhaps, if not justifiable, what are some other ways to support the industry, and how can the industry best innovate and succeed and prosper. I, of course, wrote a paper on this topic, although we have people from all sorts of different perspectives on this panel. I'm looking forward to the discussion. So our first speaker today is going to be Sir John Whittingdale, who is currently a Minister of State jointly in the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. He was previously Cabinet Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport under David Cameron. He's been a long-serving chairman of the Culture, Media and Sport Committee, holding the post from 2005 to 2015. Before being elected, Sir John served as political secretary to Margaret Thatcher. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be speaking at an IEA event. I've been involved with the IEA for as long as I can remember. Ralph Harris was a friend. I've been to Lord North Street many times, and it therefore slightly pains me that I think on this particular occasion I am not going to be wholly in agreement with the views being expressed by the IEA, which does cause me to pause at least, but I do believe what we're discussing is fundamentally important. I have long been a champion for professional journalism. I think it plays a vital part in the functioning of democracy, and it is under threat in the way that it has not previously been at this time. It's under threat in two ways. Firstly, the explosion of content out there which is not professionally sourced. Some of it is just wild speculation. Some of it is more sinister. It is misinformation. It is disinformation. It is propaganda provided by hostile states. And the best counter to fake news, if that is a term you can use to describe all of that, is professional journalism. I will be going on, I think, to speak on another Fringe meeting later this afternoon on artificial intelligence, which has escalated the challenge to professional journalism. And therefore it becomes incredibly important that professional journalistic publications or broadcasts should be sustained. But at the same time that its importance has increased, the challenges, particularly economically, have grown. If you look at the way in which news is consumed, amongst all age groups, there is a growing shift towards accessing news online, and not just online, but through social media, through Google and Facebook and others. It's particularly the case for younger age groups, where it's overwhelmingly now social media. But Google and Facebook, whilst they may distribute news, they don't employ journalists. So they are essentially feeding off the work of professional journalists, and it has been estimated that if they did not have access to professionally sourced news content, those two platforms, it might cost them something around £1 billion in lost traffic. So it is important, as I believe firstly in intellectual property rights, that those who create content are paid for its use. And that is what is in prospect in terms of news publishers being recompensed by the platforms for the use of their content. And then there is a second element, which is competition policy, and that is the disproportionate power wielded by those two tech platforms. So when it comes to negotiation as to the amount that is fair to be paid for the use of that content, then hopefully it can be achieved through mutual agreement. And actually I pay tribute particularly to Google, who the Google News Initiative has been game-changing. Huge amounts of money have been put into publishers right across the world. Every country has benefited. I'm disappointed that Facebook have just said that they're no longer going to fund the Community News Project. But Google particularly, and Facebook still to some extent, are voluntarily supporting news publishers. But it is important, given the disproportionate market power that those two organisations wield, that there is a fallback, a competition regulator to ensure that they don't abuse their market power. And that is the function of the Digital Markets Unit and the CMA. And therefore, as I remain a strong supporter of what the IEA stands for, free markets, I've always thought that those two elements, a strong competition policy and respect for intellectual property rights, are actually fundamental parts of a properly functioning free market.
Thank you very much. So our next speaker is David Matthew. He's the Managing Director of NERA. He's an antitrust and competition expert with expertise in telecommunications, media, and big tech. Before joining NERA, he was the Director of Economics at Ofcom. David.
Thanks. And thanks to the IEA. So yeah, I'm David Matthew. I'm from NERA Economic Consulting. And I'm here because we've published a report commissioned by Meta, which examines the evidence that underpins this debate, and in particular the £1 billion figure that John has just mentioned. And I want to highlight 2 points in my opening remarks. First, the challenges faced by traditional newspapers, which have been substantial, have nothing to do with posting news links on digital platforms like Google and Facebook. In fact, news publishers get benefits from those posts, as I'll discuss in a moment. Second, when you look at the evidence, it's wrong to say that Facebook, at least, and that's the one we've examined, is making large amounts of money out of news. In fact, the story is the other way. News isn't important to Facebook, and in fact, it's becoming diminishing in importance over time. So going to the first point, why have we seen these challenges? And the first observation is the challenges have been very serious. For 2 decades, there's been a very large drop in advertising revenue for newspapers and a slightly less large drop in circulation revenues. And that has happened for a very simple reason. It is the market, and it is competition, and it is the reasons that John outlined primarily. It's simply that as viewers and readers of news have turned online, they have a plethora of new options for advertisers to reach them. It's no longer the case that the traditional newspaper is your primary portal for putting an ad in front of somebody who likes sport, for example. Now you have loads of ways. And that's just new alternatives and new competition from those alternatives. In terms of the traditional cover price, the shift online has had huge effects as well. And partly it's new entry, it's new digital native news organizations, bloggers, and the other people John has mentioned. But it's also the traditional newspapers themselves. So as we speak, about half of the newspapers are free if you want to get the online edition. If you want to get news generally, you can just go to the BBC or any number of other broadcasters. They're all there, it's free, it's easy to access. So it's harder to maintain high prices if you're a newspaper in the way that it was 20 years ago. And those two dynamics are the primary driver, and they have nothing to do with snippets being on Facebook and Google. And I'll turn to those now. So, in fact, far from losing out from those snippets, news publishers get benefits from them, and the benefits are pretty straightforward. If somebody sees a link on Facebook, they click on it, it goes back to the news publisher's website, they get advertising revenue, they may encourage someone to take a subscription, and that has value to them. And that's why news publishers are posting content on Facebook and Google in the first place. So all newspapers have a Facebook page. Many of them advertise on Facebook. And on the facts, if you look at what Facebook users are doing, 90% of views of news articles on Facebook are of links to articles that were published by the newspapers themselves. So it's not Facebook that's prioritizing news content to attract people. It's news publishers are using Facebook as a useful way of getting access to their website. If you like, it's a form of free advertising. When we turn to Facebook's side, it's really not, news content really just isn't a priority for them. Facts are only 3% of posts in Facebook using these are news content, and that's broadly defined, not just a traditional newspaper. And if the news links weren't there, something else would be. You know, a picture of someone's cat, and advertising revenue follows eyeballs, not what the eyeballs are watching, and the advertising revenue would be pretty much the same, even if there was no news content at all. And Facebook users say they want less news, not more. Use of Facebook for news in the UK is one of the lowest of a variety of different countries. And even in Canada, where news has recently been taken off Facebook, use of Facebook for news there is quite a lot higher than it is in the UK. So the story just doesn't back the claim that Facebook is trouncing the money from this content. They're not, and the trend is less news, not more. So that leads you to the bottom line. Is the current arrangement where nobody pays anybody else, which is characteristic of the entire internet, unfair bargaining? Our analysis just says no, it isn't. It actually looks like quite a good deal for newspapers.
Thank you very much, David. So our next speaker is Owen Meredith, who's the CEO of the News Media Association. He was previously the CEO of the Professional Publishers Association. He stood as a parliamentary candidate in 2017 general election, narrowly missing out being elected MP for Newcastle under time. Owen sits on industry boards, including the Advertising Association, World Association of Newspapers and News Publishers, Advertising Standards Board of Finance, and News Media Europe. Owen, thank you very much.
Thanks for the full CV, Matthew.
It's very impressive. Also, you don't have Matthew in your name. It makes you almost unique on this panel.
Exactly. Thank you. Look, I think this is a really important and interesting discussion, and I guess there are three areas I would open up with, and hopefully we can get into some of that challenge, and I can debunk some of the myths that David just told you, and no doubt you'll hear from other panelists as we go forward. I think there's three things. So, firstly, the value of news to tech platforms. Secondly, the societal value of news, and as John talked about, why we all value independent news in this country. And thirdly, the commercial market terms, and I think in an IEA event, those are the important things. So the value of news to platforms, as John said, a study published 2 years ago, I think it was, suggested that the value of news content to platforms is around £1 billion. That's not a sum that the news industry is saying the platforms owe the news industry. It's a simple calculation based on the data that we have, and we don't have perfect, accurate data because there is zero transparency in terms of the way that a lot of these platforms operate. So that sum reflects how platforms generate money, primarily through advertising, and with news content in search and on Facebook and other social media platforms, they generate huge value because you as loyal customers who are going to those places to find news, find it. Google, for example, doesn't sell advertising directly around most news search results, but it generates huge value from you expecting to find reliable sources of news when you go there. And that's why you go to Google to ask them other questions like where you get the best Nike trainers or whatever the question might be. So there is a misunderstanding from the side, from the tech lobby who argue against the value of news in their platform, because they look at it simply of if you have a news item and we sell advertising next to it, what's that equation? That's not the equation. It's a much more broad equation. It's a broader measure of value, and it's about how value is exchanged between the platform and the intrinsic way in which platforms work and the data that they get from you and about you to be able to sell broader advertising as a result. The second, as John talked about briefly, is the societal value of news. We have seen a fundamental shift in the news economy, in the way that users access their news, and therefore the fundamental financial sustainability and business model of the news sector. But I think all of us in this room who attend party conferences understand there is a huge value of independent news sources. David mentioned the BBC. I don't think any of us at Conservative Party conference would want to see the BBC as the sole source of news in this country. So we need independent commercial news publishers to be able to report on what is happening in our society. And the third thing, and I'm going to then wrap up so that we can move on to other panellists and get into more of a broad discussion, is that this is fundamentally a question of a broken economic system and a broken market. There have been independent reports by the CMA and plenty of others who have demonstrated that the tech market is not working. It is monopolistic. There are a few huge players who are abusing their power. That is not good for business, it is not good for consumers, and therefore it's not good for society. So we need to address this challenge. We need to unpick and unleash the market so that it can work properly, and at the moment, that's not happening. So what the Digital Markets Bill that's before Parliament does is gives the regulator the tools to be able to act in a way that is appropriate, that is checked and has balance, but is also able to act at speed. It's taken the best part of 10 years since independent reports recommended that the regulator needed these new powers. It's taken 10 years to get the Act before Parliament. It still isn't on the statute book. It probably won't be until February or March next year. We cannot simply wait another 10 years for legislation to keep up. And as John said, I think AI is going to accelerate the way that the entire industry is changing. And without having appropriate and flexible tools as a regulator, I think we're all going to lose out.
Thank you very much, Owen. So our next speaker is Matt Warman MP. He was elected in 2015 and he served as the Digital Culture, Media and Sport Minister in 2012, and he's previously served as the Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for Digital and Broadband between 2019 and 2021. Before being elected, he was the Telegraph's technology editor and has worked as a technology consultant.
Lovely, thank you. And I think it's a really interesting discussion, and there's a danger that we end up talking across each other, because fundamentally there are two central tenets, I think, to this conversation. The first is that journalism is a deeply financially troubled industry that is clearly an essential part of a democracy. And government has a role to play, and we can argue about what the best way of playing that role is, but indisputably government has a role in ensuring that that is something that persists in this country. It would be unforgivable for the government to allow, either by a sin of omission or for in any more active way, to allow particularly local journalism, but journalism more generally, to enter a position where it was fundamentally unsustainable. So that's one starting point. The second starting point for me is simply that it is an obvious truth that the relationship between social media and news organisations is a symbiotic one. We can argue about the precise details of who gets revenue from what, but it is obvious that there is a benefit to Facebook and Google and Twitter to having news publishers on their sites using them actively, and there is a benefit to the news organisations having access to those platforms. So the fact that there is an exchange of value there seems to me that you can have some very dry economic regulatory arguments with the greatest respect, but it is obviously true that there is a relationship there, and that is why, as John says, you've seen organisations like Google take a pragmatic approach to this and say, look, there is clearly a reasonable case for money to change hands. You are obviously seeing some of that for fear of regulatory intervention, but that doesn't change the fact that it is an acknowledgement of a fundamental fairness that needs to be built into the system. So the only question for me really is therefore how do you organise that relationship in such a way that there is, as John describes, a fair backstop, and that ideally would be avoided. And I suppose one of the things I can't quite understand is why an organisation like Facebook, that is a big, savvy part of an enormous tech ecosystem and has been round the block of trying to resist regulation and ended up getting regulated, I'm not quite sure why Facebook would take the approach of saying, well, we're just going to try and avoid this because we think we can. Because it seems to be very, very unlikely that that will be the case, especially when Google is taking a divergent approach. So I think, for me, government's role here has to be to say, how do we try and set up a set of conditions that really push in favour of a voluntary logical agreement, but ultimately do say there is a reason why you would want to give the regulator those tools to do something that is a necessary evil, if I can put it like that, because if we don't, I think we will, and it sounds trite, but I think it's true, fundamentally, you don't know what till it's gone. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And that is the position that we risk finding ourselves in for journalism. It is a legitimate task of government to try and make that sustainable in as light touch a way as we possibly can, but it would be a dereliction of duty to pretend that it's nothing to do with the government.
Thank you very much. So our final introductory speaker is Matthew Sinclair. He is the Senior Director at the Computer and Telecommunications Industry Association, recently appointed effectively their UK lead. He formerly served as Chief Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister, and he's also held numerous senior roles, including a Director at Deloitte, Head of Economics at Westbourne Communications, and Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance. Matthew.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. So I just wanted to talk about a few points here. The first is about competition and where is the kind of competition or the absence of it creating a problem for the news industry. And then I wanted to talk about I think what Matt's good point there of why isn't it important for government to find a light touch way to achieve this role of recognising the value of news? Because I think that really gets to the core of what is going wrong with the law that's in front of Parliament right now, and why there is a bigger picture beyond the future of journalism which we need to bear in mind with DMCC. So just to start with competition, I think that it's important to remember that there's a lot of problems being created by a lot of competition in the digital advertising market. So, as Owen says, there are old reports about the digital ads market which are now thoroughly out of date. So if you look at the Thurman Review, for example, it draws this neat picture of a rising market share in the largest players in the digital advertising market, which has basically started to reverse from the day Thurman published. And because you've seen TikTok erupt onto the scene, because you've seen every e-commerce player under the sun starting a digital advertising business, because you've seen streaming players transitioning from streaming video on demand to advertising partly or entirely funded video on demand. So the digital ad market is competitive, and that is making it hard for newspaper groups. And so we need to recognise that. But if we try and solve a problem with policy mechanisms which are predicated on a lack of competition, in addressing a market where there are problems being created for valuable industries because there's too much competition, we're going to get really bad outcomes, right? There's going to be a problem there because we've misdiagnosed the problem. I think we've seen in recent years that there is plenty of potential for new platforms to burst into that crucial advertising market, and they've done so. And they've done so at scale, and they're going to continue to do so. And they are not. And I think that we need to bear that in mind. We need to be careful about the nature of the problem that's confronting the news industry. Because I think there's lots to be optimistic about with the news industry. It has shown, its value, through the war in Ukraine, through COVID-19, and there should be a process by which it continues to evolve that its business model over time, and it's been doing so. But I think, and it's to start to come on to the danger here, the danger is that what we're instead going to do is we're going to turn it into a regulated industry. The news is going to go to, after centuries where the British media, I think, has been particularly distinctive and has been distinctive in the world because it's had that close relationship with its readers, viewers, listeners. We're going to go to a world where it will live or die based on its relationship with the Competition and Markets Authority, based on its relationship with this enormous unchecked regulatory power. And I don't think that's in the interest of the news industry. I can see the appeal, right? Big dollar signs, right? I can see the appeal, right? But I think people need to be really careful of what kind of news industry you have in 10, 20 years when you have it depending on regulatory affairs. These are going to become regulatory affairs businesses, right? And if that means it's going to be really hard for the little guys in the media industry because building that relationship with the CMA is a fixed cost. Regulatory affairs function is always harder for smaller players. I think it's going to be unreliable because this is not the news subsidy bill. Whether that would be a good idea or not, it's not. It's covering every sector of the economy. And you know what? Every sector of the economy has an important story about its social value. The news industry story is true, but so is the story for all kinds of other sectors in our economy. And they are going to come and say, I want my share of this value. I want our sector to have this regulation. And the news industry is not necessarily going to be at the front of that queue. And so I think the sector wants to be really careful about making this bet on being cross-subsidized from, in the end, let's be realistic, users of digital platforms. I think setting that up as a regulatory business model, I think, is a huge risk. And I think that kind of comes on to Matt's point, which is what we don't have in front of Parliament at the moment is a neat bill that says, here is what we see as the value of news, and here is the lightest touch mechanism we can find to reflect that. What we instead have is fundamental changes to the competition architecture. We are no longer going to have normal merits review of competition cases by the Competition Appeals Tribunal if this is regulated under this new digital regime. So we're going to have fewer checks on mistakes by the regulator. When the regulator, there has been weaknesses put in place in terms of the focus, the requirements on the CMA to consider the consumer interest in its regulations, to consider when we look at this intervention in the round, is it in consumers' interests? So you're going to have a competition regime which is less focused on consumer interest, where the regulator is subject to fewer of the checks and balances that will keep them on the right path. And we're going to achieve all of that. I'm afraid this doesn't meet this test you've set out, Matt, right? That is not your light touch mechanism to reflect the value of news. And so I think, I think there's a lot of technical debates to get into the value exchange, etc. But I think at its core, just ask, does a fundamental rewrite of competition policy flow from what you've heard here about how news is socially important? I don't think it does, and I think that given the competition we can see in digital markets, there is a huge risk this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, where it becomes harder to launch new digital services, and this market starts to become genuinely less competitive over time if government steps in with a heavy hand right now.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask a few questions before we go to the audience. So, John, if I may start with you, I'm interested in this question about whether or not the policy intent when it comes to the digital markets bill is to effectively force a kind of commercial arrangement between a publisher and a digital platform. Would there always be an option for a digital platform to effectively pull out of the market to say, we're not interested in having news on our platform? Or would there be effectively some kind of must-carry requirement? There'd be an expectation that they'd continue hosting content?
I would certainly not have any kind of must-carry for a digital platform, and lots of digital platforms don't. Although it is notable that it is right. I mean, Matthew talked about the advent of TikTok. I mean, there are other players entering. I was doing a Spectator Fringe meeting yesterday, and I think Fraser Nelson said that in terms of the list of places to go to obtain news, Instagram is now number 9, apparently. But no, I mean, I agree with what Matt Warman said. Ideally,
You're going to be careful. You nearly got it.
The ideal outcome is that government doesn't get involved in this at all. And actually, we've already seen quite a lot of success in arrangements being reached between publishers and platforms. All right, maybe the fact that the government has indicated that this bill was going to be passed has spurred that along. But if it works properly, I hope the CMA will never get involved, because I hope that the two parties will be able to reach an agreement between them.
Owen, I'm wondering if we can pick you up on that point about the claimed value, and I think this is quite central to the debate, of news to digital platforms. We saw recently in Canada, at least some digital platforms, I think including Meta, withdraw news from their platform, and the result was that the use of Meta remained roughly unchanged, according to some independent data sources. It doesn't seem like another story here as well is that post-2016, Meta famously reduced the amount of news content, much to the frustration of publishers on their platform. But again, it didn't seem to have a big impact on their revenues or their traffic over that immediate period after 2016. So I'm wondering how you kind of respond to those arguments, effectively the same ones made by David, about this question of, is there actually a substantive value of news publisher content as opposed to any other type of content on the platforms?
Well, sorry.
Do you want to go, Owen, and then you can come back, John?
Yeah, Owen, go.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right in some ways, that there are two questions on this. One is a economic question, and one is a societal question. On a societal basis, if you look at Ofcom's news consumption report, which they do annually, Facebook is the third highest stated platform or location where people get their news. So if we've got a huge proportion of the British population going to Facebook for news, what do you want them to find? Do you want them to find articles from news publishers who I represent that are editorially controlled, that are subject to standards, that have complaints procedures and everything else that makes them a professional journalistic outfit? Or do you want them to find the mis and disinformation that John talked about earlier? And we can have that debate. If we want to strip news out that's created by professional journalists and we just want the internet to be swamped with mis and disinformation, go ahead. I don't think that's a good thing for society. I think we'd want to intervene and stop that. On the economic argument, Matt said earlier, this is not a clean, simple news payment bill in the same way that we've had in Australia and Canada. It's not. It's an economy-wide intervention because the entire digital economy is broken. Repeated reports have said that. There is a dominance of a small number of players, and despite what Matt said, there is not huge competition with new players coming into the ad market. Still, the vast majority of money in online advertising flows through one or two players, predominantly Google. And what we are seeing is a complete abuse of that power because Google operates in the advertising market on both the buy and sell side. I don't think you would allow that in any other economy or ecosystem. So we need to fix it. We need to give the regulator the tools, and that's why Matt and John are right, that we need to get on and pass this bill so that the regulator has those powers, but that then gives a greater transparency of information so that the two partners, the publishers in this case, and the platforms on the other side, can come to a commercial terms and commercially agree what the right value exchange is. That's all we're doing here.
John?
I think it's really dangerous.
I
think it's really dangerous if you start from where we say any sort of industry where you can see a large business, there is a problem here, and the competition regulators needs to step in. The question which economists, regulators, and everyone should be looking to is are these businesses subject to competitive challenge? And that's what we've seen in recent years. We've seen new entries. That's why the incredible growth of TikTok, the incredible growth of e-commerce platforms in the digital ad market, you just could not ask for a clearer demonstration that the sector is still subject to extensive competitive challenge, both at the consumer side, with consumers shifting between digital platforms, and on the advertiser side, in terms of advertisers shifting budgets to new options. And I think to come back to that exchange of value, I think I'm going to assume there's some Conservative Party members in the room, right? So suppose you're writing an association newsletter, and you write up an article from a local that you've seen in the local newspaper, right? I'm going to say, with some confidence, you do not have market power, right? You are not a big business, right? You're writing an association newsletter. Does that mean that you would write a check to the newspaper that you've cited? No, you wouldn't, and no one expects you wouldn't. And there is a whole host of organisations, large and small, throughout the digital economy who link to each other, and it's much more likely that the person being linked to will pay than the person who's linking, right? That's the whole advertising market. There is this unreality about looking at one side of this exchange of value and saying, oh, therefore, we need to crystallize this into a commercial contract. And unfortunately, I think what it is it's evading, I think, trying to find that more long-term sustainable solution in terms of business model and looking for what is, in the end, they're asking for a regulatory bailout. And I think doing that at the price of a regulatory power which can be applied anywhere in the economy is subject to fewer checks in terms of consumer interest, fewer checks in terms of tribunal scrutiny than competition policy has been up to now, I think is just really dangerous, because we're enabling a general empowerment here to oversee markets on the basis, I think, of a lot of people with a very understandable belief in the value of journalism, which they and this is a tool, right? And so they're reaching to that rather than asking, is it the right policy response to the problem that's in front of us?
So, Matt Warman, I kind of wanted to build on the point about that you were discussing earlier about, I suppose, everyone's goal for a thriving kind of news industry and journalism sector. One of the concerns about the potential kind of bargaining scheme is, and certainly seen this in the Australian case, where the vast majority of the transfers basically go to two companies, go to Nine Entertainment and News Limited. From an economic perspective, that seems to sustain the traditional publishers and kind of logically as a result lead to their sustained market position, but with basically punishing anyone who might want to be an upstart. If you're setting up a local news Substack, which does exist, there's a Manchester evening news, I think it's called Substack, that people can subscribe to, you're probably not going to be able to get those payments. So therefore you're giving a big advantage to these larger companies rather than having a kind of more diverse, innovative news sector.
So look, I think the question comes down to, if you end up with a system that does get used, and I think John is right to say there is a version where this is the stick that doesn't get used, and that's what forces people into a better position. Now that's an uncomfortable position to be in the first place, because you shouldn't. I don't, in principle, believe in giving regulators powers in the knowledge that we don't want them to use them. But there does have to be a backstop somewhere there. But all of the arguments that people are making against this is essentially, if the regulator regulates really badly, then we will get a badly regulated market. And it's like, well, yeah, we would. That's true. But it's Parliament's job to stand somewhere on a slippery slope, right? It is Parliament's job to set up the regulator so that it has the tools to do what it needs to do. And it's obviously right that if that regulator ends up with a system that massively privileges the existing big players and completely ignores potential for new entrants or new markets, then of course that would be bad. But no one is arguing in favour of the regulator doing a bad job. And I think it is government's job to set up a framework that means that this is not entirely unchecked. There is a difference between an independent regulator and an unchecked regulator. And of course it has to be kept under what government euphemistically calls review. But it is important to say that the argument that turning this into a purist argument of regulate versus don't regulate, it is going to be to everyone's detriment. Because if you're going to take that approach, you will simply end up in a position where you'll look back in a few years' time and say, well, what should we have done then? And that will not be great.
So, Matt, to that point, I think, so what the ways we've traditionally had, because as you say, because of course one of the dangers then is you start to sort of dissociate yourself and you say, well, the regulator just needs to do a good job. But good regulators come from setting the framework up right at the start, right? And I think that's where there is a responsibility on parliamentarians to ask, multiple people, let's say with the Competition Appeals Tribunal, have basically said this is something the CMA's wanted to get rid of for years. It's now being snuck through that they're not going to be subject to normal merits review. A number of lawyers have looked at this and made the point there are structural weaknesses in how consumer interests are going to be considered in this bill. And so I think absolutely I think look, if there's ever a place for a purist debate over whether we should regulate or not, it's the IEA. I don't think we should lose sight of that. Like, these are competitive markets. Do they need an intervention is a legitimate question.
David,
but I think there's also, has Parliament put those constraints in place yet?
So just to come back on that, look, I'm not sitting here saying that this is a perfect bill, and I know that John is contractually obliged to say it's perfect, and until the government proposes government amendments which acknowledge that it is not perfect. But there is could it be better? Yes. Does it undermine the principle that it needs to be done in some form? No.
David, I want to come back to you as someone with experience in a regulator. I'm interested by this point of, well, let's give a regulator a power they don't necessarily need to use, but they can pressure companies anyway. That doesn't seem like an ideal policy-making process to me in some ways, that you're effectively almost blackmailing a company into doing something because of the threat of regulation. It's just kind of the same thing as regulation in some respects.
Yeah, so on the regulatory arrangements that are proposed here, the general idea is something called final offer arbitration. And the theory is that all you need to do is say, as long as a regulator can intervene if things get bad, commercial arrangements will happen, they'll get sold, and the regulator will actually be able to put their feet up on the desk and never have to do anything. And a lifetime in the trenches of antitrust or regulation cases tells me that is just not going to happen. What happens is there are too many vested interests and there is enough commercial value floating around that a successful outcome means you hire the lawyers, you hire firms like mine, you do those things, you hire regulatory staff if you're big enough, and you do those things and you deploy them as a profit center to get the best deal you can out of the regulator. So the idea is that it's all going to work smoothly and costly. I just think won't stand up to more than the very first exchanges. I did want to come back just on some points that Owen made, though, because going back to the reasons why we're here, myths are around, and the myth remains that the digital platforms are running off with £1 billion of newspapers' money, and that simply hasn't been established. Just on the technicalities, the forensic analysis that the Competition and Markets Authority and my former employer Ofcom did on this was utterly explicit that they haven't even started to look into who gets the value out of this deal. We've agreed, I think, on this panel that both sides do get value, and the implication of the work we've done and we've seen is that for Facebook at least, if you look at who's getting the value here, newspapers, if anything, are getting more from the deal than Facebook is. And so if you want to ask, is there an unfair commercial deal? And you say, well, what would happen if I had a real commercial deal? Actually, what you've got there is already a commercial deal of its type. You might well end up saying, well, firstly, who gets most out of this? If it's newspapers, the commercial deal would be newspapers pay for access to Facebook. That would be where it take you. And we're building this whole thing on sand because nobody has yet established with any remote credibility that there actually is a large imbalance in who's getting the value here. So,
yeah, I mean, I think there were some specific issues with that 1 billion figure, that it was kind of extrapolating out from 6% of online time is news, and therefore 6% of tech revenues must be from news. But of course, there's no way you can just say, well, A doesn't necessarily lead to B. It feels like a very extended claim.
Yeah, just on your point about the sort of Damocles method of achieving regulatory objectives, right? I think the danger you're getting at is that it can lose a lot of transparency and it can lose a certain element of the rule of law, right? If regulators achieve things with a kind of vague threat, kind of fall in line, or we're going to really hammer you, you're not going to have. Firstly, they have the power, not Parliament. And it's important to remember that these equivalents of like the Australian News Media Bargaining Code aren't going to be created in Parliament, right? They're going to be created by a regulator, acting without that parliamentary scrutiny, but making essentially political decisions. And so that regulator then gets politicized, and you don't have that transparency that comes from here is a decision and here is the justification. Instead, you have that kind of, as you say, that shadowy process where of firms responding to a regulatory threat that I think we've seen in a number of sectors, and I think is problematic when regulators get overpowered.
So,
we're going to go to audience questions in just a second, but so
just say so. It's one of those things that is philosophically problematic, but sort of is actually what we live with in real life every day, right? Like you do bad things, you might go to prison. Is this the sort of Damocles method of regulation, or is it just how real life works? I think you've got to at some point pragmatism has to intervene, and you have to acknowledge that regulators can behave in an independent way and not be politicised, and bad regulators get politicised.
But I think that you will politicise regulators when you ask them to make distributional decisions within digital platforms. Because if you forget, like, these platforms are an exchange, like, so for example, between users and advertisers and newspapers. There's multiple platforms using these platforms, and their job is to balance the interests of those different user groups. Once you have a regulator getting involved, making these kind of political decisions, that's what politicises them. I think there's a danger we treat this as, well, that's a thing that happens in other countries. British regulators wouldn't get politicised. But the reasons they've avoided that is because they've had external scrutiny and because we've kept their responsibilities limited.
I want to go to some questions, although this discussion has been fantastic. We'll do 3 at a time, maybe this gentleman at the front here.
Thank you. That's working. Will Lane, Government Affairs at the Advertising Association and Kensington and Chelsea councillor. The panel briefly touched on the Canadian example and what has happened there. I'm curious to know what your opinion is on what the impact has been in Canada, both on journalists and citizens, of news being withdrawn by Meta. And what is the risk of the same thing happening in the UK should DMCC pass?
Okay, Canadian example. Next up, the gentleman in the middle there.
Dominic Connor, Conservative Technology Forum. Over there is Nigel Farage. He's doing journalism. He's interviewing politicians.
Sort of.
Exactly my point. What is news? Is Top Gear magazine news? Is The Sun news? Is the 2/3 of the Sunday Times, which is given over to what appear to be ludicrously ugly clothes and cruises, is that news? Can I just have a definition of news that isn't the person I likes The Guardian or likes the Daily Express? Can I have a definition of that, of the people that are going to get this money? And speaking as a journalist who has a degree in computer science and then went off and did economics for a while, am I the only person who laughed out loud at the idea that funding news publishers will cause more news? I mean, if you've worked as a journalist, as I have, you have conversations with your editor and your publisher. Say, I would like to write this series of articles about this, which is important to the world. And he will look at you with these old, sad eyes and say, yeah, but there's no money in that, Dominic. We won't have a budget for that. If you give money to companies, these are businesses. They will say, thank you, Mr. Facebook, for your $1 billion. Mr. Murdoch, or the junior Murdoch, will take that money quite happily. Does anyone believe that we'll actually get or even retain the amount of news we have now? Will anyone actually say that?
Okay.
In public?
Why don't we go to the lady behind you?
Hiya, I'm Ailey from the PPA, and I just had a question for Matt Sinclair about his point about feeling disturbed about the idea of the fate of the future of news and publishers lying in the hands with regulators, because that's undemocratic. Do you not think it would be worse in the current settings of market failure, where that future lies in the hands of a very small number of private tech companies who have no accountability to government at all whatsoever?
No, so
Okay, why don't we go to Owen first, just because he hasn't had a chance to say anything for a while. If there's anything you want to come back on, and maybe particularly on that point about how certain are we that this will actually increase news, is it not likely just to basically fatten the profits of some of your members?
So, I'll take the two specifics, and I just want to touch on the £1 billion figure in the study. That is not a demand from the news industry, as I outlined earlier. It's not a demand from the news industry to say tech owes us £1 billion. It's a attempt to calculate the value that news brings to those tech platforms. I'm very happy to have a negotiation over how much of that is actually owed to us, or vice versa, frankly. But you've got to be able to make that assessment. And at the moment, there is a complete lack of transparency to be able to properly calculate that number. I admit that. So it might not be $1 billion. That might be the wrong number. But give me the data, allow us to do it. Let's have the transparency over where that value sits. And then we can negotiate on commercial terms as to what financial exchange or other exchange there should be as a result. In terms of the gentleman's question about does it lead to more news? It doesn't lead to more news, clearly, but it does lead to better reporting and better covering of news. And what we've seen in Australia is a huge expansion of newsrooms, having more journalists to make sure that we can cover more of what's happening in society. Holding power to account is exactly what journalism is about. I don't think that's what Nigel Farage is doing, by the way. And I think that demonstration is what's really important. And if you flip the equation the other way around, if we don't fix this broken market and we don't fix this broken economy, we won't have any journalism and any independent journalism in this country because there simply won't be any money flowing into newsrooms at all.
So, John, do you want to comment on this, or really any of those points that may be of interest? Maybe either kind of Canadian example, if you've been studying that closely, and its impact, or that question about profit.
I would like to come back on this question about journalism, because it's something we've been thinking about a great deal, not just in this context, but for instance in the online safety bill, where we created special categories for journalistic content. Journalism is expensive. So, the Russell Brand investigation took a year. That was a lot of commitment. Ukraine, you have reporters out there. I mean, that is not just risking their lives, but actually it's a huge commitment on the part of news organisations. Nigel Farage is not a journalist. He's a chat show host, if you like, a political chat show, and in the same way that a number of my colleagues in Parliament are now hosting political chat shows, which I'm perfectly happy that they should do. But journalism is about investigation, it takes time, and it plays a really important role in making sure that, firstly, people are informed and able to make informed choices at elections, and also holding power to account and uncovering scandals, corruption, abuse of power. And that is what has to be sustained, and this is a mechanism, I think, fairly, to ensure that professional journalism is still properly funded by those who benefit from it.
Matthew Sinclair, do you want to come back on the point that was directly the question to you about the state of the market?
So, I'd separate two questions, right? The first one is what should determine the ongoing success of the news industry, and in the end, it's going to have to be that ability to engage and inform readers, who have plenty of other options, which may or may not be news, but may not have the same democratic or social value, right? So that needs to be the criteria by which the news industry succeeds or fails. Can it engage a load of kids who maybe would rather be watching someone else play video games, right? That should be the challenge. But I think the problem is, if that gets separated from the commercial imperative, I think Dave Perez's point was good. If the success or failure of the organisation becomes about that ability to walk into the CMA with an effective regulatory affairs team, rather than that ability to grow new audiences, that is going to do more than anything to erode the social value of news over time. And that's why I think that although I completely understand the kind of immediate incentive to pursue this bill, I think it is a mistake for the news industry in the medium term. But in terms of the longer-term power question that you were kind of, I think, neatly aligning with that, the question then becomes, if we see a market where we think there is a problem and we need to intervene, so suppose we just ultimately decide we don't think news can solve this business model problem, which I don't really see the evidence for that. There are newspaper groups which have done quite well in recent years because they have kind of figured out their business model. But suppose we just think that's not solvable for some or all newspaper organisations. it feels to me that is a distributional question where it's essentially political question that Parliament needs to answer. How are we going to support this socially or democratically valuable activity? I don't think that job belongs to a regulator which is supposed to be there to enforce competition law. And so I think that's where it's almost like, okay, first question, where should the future of news lie? Second question, where there is a case for a public policy intervention, should that be done democratically, or should that be done through this open-ended regulatory commitment where they can intervene with basically as few checks and as few sort of a little external scrutiny as the government could kind of, put forward with a straight face.
And we'll come back to you, David and Matt. Or do you want to come in now briefly before we do some more questions?
I just wanted to come back on the claim that access to Facebook and Google is the entire foundation for the entire news industry. I think Owen was suggesting that. That's simply not true. It's hyperbole because essentially it's true that access to Facebook referral traffic is valuable to some newspapers. It's a source of value to them. They get more customers back to their sites that way. But we've estimated that value might be of the order of magnitude of maybe 1% to 2% of revenues a year. So it's definitely not make or break for anything. And subsequently, the NMA has actually published a further report that suggests even that estimate might be exaggerated. So we're talking about small numbers here, and it's just to reinforce that point that this approach to solving the potential problems is really barking up the wrong tree.
Matt Warman?
So I think there is some truth in all of this, right? At the risk of being the annoying middle of the road person, it is obviously true that there is to some extent a competition element to the problems facing the news industry. You can't. I don't think it's reasonable to say, well, they're not the whole thing, so we're going to ignore them completely. I think it is possible that this needs a multi-pronged approach. Most of that is not actually from government, I think, and I think about Dominic's question about sort of what is news versus implicitly versus what is journalism. I spent 15 years at the Telegraph. I did almost no hardcore investigative news. It was all journalism, though. And more or less, and I think, and so sort of some of that might, in theory, come under a sort of regulatory orbit. Most of it is purely commercial, and that's where it should stay.
We'll go back for a final set of questions and then some concluding remarks. The gentleman there.
Thanks very much. This might be the highest concentration of Matthews I've ever known because I'm also another Matthew. My question's on sort of one of the quibbles I have with what you've said about digital platforms is that about the opportunity. So you could write 10, 20, 30 articles, send it to your local paper, send it to the news publishers, and never get a single one out there. But then you put one tweet or one TikTok or one thing on social media and bam, more views, more engagements, more followers than anything that you've seen previously. So one of the questions I have for the future of journalism is how can you provide that opportunity? Because, I mean, my generation, I've never known anything where you can just put one thing out there, 140 characters, and you could be, all over the place the next morning.
There was another question, I think, at the back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm James. I spent 20 years with Channel 4 Dispatches. I'm not an investigative journalist anymore, partly because of the money. It was dying as an industry. I'm now press and public affairs for NUS. Don't hate me. I'm talking in personal capacity here, though, not as NUS. The problem is that you were talking about the hardcore investigative journalism has to be propped up by something. Okay, it's not commercially viable on its own. And going back to what the gentleman who's also a journalist said, I've got nothing against Nigel Farage and things like Guido Fawkes. They're perfectly fine, but they're columnists, they're commentators. If you look at all the major stories which are broken, Hunter Biden's laptop broken by the New York Post, Murdoch's tabloid, any story, cash for peerages, I'm choosing examples which the audience will like. Cash for peerages was broken by, I think it was the Telegraph, the Times. Name me an alternative media source which does proper investigative journalism and has dug a story. You will miss it when it's gone. Okay, now it's all going at the Tory government, dispatches, etc., and so a lot of people won't sympathise with it. But in 5 years, 10 years' time, when Keir Starmer's in office, and you guys want him held to account, it's going. It needs something to prop it up. That's why I left. That's why I'm now working for NUS, because there's no money in it anymore.
We're running to time, so I'm happy to give everyone basically an opportunity, 1 minute, to either respond to that or make some concluding remarks. You can go first, Matt, if you like.
I just wanted to take those two last comments in there, because I think it's just important we recognise that both sides of this are true, right? Like, the opportunity for people to take what they have to say to an audience is valuable in itself, valuable to them. They value that. And it has social value, and it can be really important. And there is a danger that because we see sort of the fringe of that where that goes wrong, which is real, that we sort of forget about that kind of massive of interaction that's enabled by digital platforms, of people being able to take their story to the world. And we should not lose sight of the value of that. But at the same time, absolutely, it's not going to be a valid substitute for investigative journalism. But I think, and as you say, journalism has almost always been a bundle of sort of some very worthy stuff that's not very profitable, and some less highfalutin stuff that pays the bills. And so there's always been a tension. I completely understand that. But I would just ask, and this is just I'm sorry to keep coming back to this question because I know it's the dry one, but what part of that leads you logically and neatly to the conclusion, therefore we need to rewrite UK competition law? Because what you're speaking to there is a problem of lots of competition, which makes it harder for news organisations to cross-subsidise important parts of what they do. And I see that and I recognise that. But, trying to sustain cross-subsidies by turning these into regulatory affairs organisations won't produce the journalistic organisations you want. I would just caution on that. I think it will produce worse news organisations, and I think it will corrupt our wider regulatory structure. So I would just urge that, you can believe a lot of what you're saying there and think that we should look at a more proximate solution to the economics of investigatory journalism.
Matt Warman.
So I sort of agree with that, except your question, Matthew, is sort of what leads logically and neatly to this solution. It's like, well, nothing in politics is logical or neat, really. And the fact that we are reaching for a solution that will make a positive difference is not the whole solution. That does not of itself mean that it's a bad thing. And I think the first question that was asked, sort of, what's the difference between someone who's posting on Twitter and someone who's part of a proper news organisation? Like, journalism is all about gatekeeping. It's all about values. It's all about saying that person that might be absolutely onto something and has put some fantastic tweet out that's uncovered some amazing truth. That's a great thing, but it is not the same as the comprehensive, verified, expensive, imperfect business of journalism. And it is legitimate for government to say, how do we try and help sustain an industry that we think is a democratic necessity? And no, it's not neat, no, it's not perfectly logical, but it is essential.
Owen?
I guess just to sum up, I think those two questions are, again, about the societal value of news. I think all of us in this room, all of us engaged in politics, understand the societal value of news. Therefore, we've got to do something to support it. Go out and buy a newspaper when you leave here today. If you haven't already, that's one way you can help sustain news. But to go to Matt's point and the fundamental discussion around the digital markets legislation, why are we rewriting competition law? Because competition law isn't working in this market. There is not proper competition in the digital market. We need to fix it. That's why we need to pass the bill.
David?
Yeah, so we disagreed. There is nothing suggesting that there is a competition problem in the bargaining relationships between newspapers and Google or Facebook. And even the authorities that have looked into this, the CMA and Ofcom, have not reached that view. They have explicitly not looked into it, and our report shows that the evidence isn't there to support it. And that means the suggestion is to bring in regulation before a problem has been established, and I think that, in my experience, is the first time I've actually seen that happen. There is no foundation for taking that step here.
Sir John?
The point made earlier about the importance of news is something I passionately believe in. And it is important that we find a way of sustaining it. But I wouldn't support just coming along and saying, well, news needs a secure source of revenue. There are these platforms that are making lots of money, so let's go and take some of that money and give it to them. There is actually a rationale behind it. We can argue about whether or not it's £1 billion or whatever it is. There is no doubt that the platforms have benefited from people going to them and using them as a news source. And the surveys show, particularly amongst younger people, overwhelmingly it is their principal source of news. And if that is to continue to be something that they are able to offer, they have to have the content, and the content is supplied to them, or they take from professional journalist organisations. So it essentially is about ensuring that the platforms recognise the value of news to them, which they do, which is why they are supporting journalism through these various initiatives. And the CMA, as I say, people don't like the idea of having a regulatory system which is not used because it's done by voluntary arrangement, but actually that takes place in a number of other areas. But I think it is important that there is a mechanism to ensure that the agreement is reached fairly.
Well, thank you very much to our excellent panelists, Matthew, John, Owen, David, and Matt, for what was a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending this session, and please do enjoy the rest of your party conference.